Welcome back to my art channel, where today I'll test out a new color palette in a variety of ways. Getting new art materials is always exciting, but also a bit intimidating, as I have to familiarize myself with all of these new paints or a new color palette. What kind of textures can we create? How should we mix them? What are the limits of a color selection or an art medium? While I love swatching new art supplies, like I'm doing here, no matter if pencils, watercolors, markers, or gouache, to see them in their purest form and to become familiar with them. This is really more of a documentation than a creative process. It's a very bare bones first introduction, and after it I have a whole bunch of more artsy things I like to do with new supplies. And I actually ended up doing all of my usual ones, as well as a completely new approach for this set of Irodori gouache, the autumn set by Holbein. So I hope that no matter what kind of art supplies you want to experiment and play around with, there's one or two ways here that inspire you as well. The swatches are pretty straightforward. These are gouache paints, so there's a variety of transparency I can test out. Honestly, the Holbein gouache are great for transparent layers as well. And I especially like the antique rich gold in this set, a warmer shade than the antique gold in the winter palette. After swatching these, I actually jumped straight into a comfort art zone of mine, movie scene studies. I picked a scene from Crimson Peak because it, at first glance, looked like something these paints would be a good fit for, without actually being an autumn landscape. Why movie scenes? When I try to learn more about a new set of colors or any art material, using a reference that already has a strong artistic direction feels like riding a bicycle, but with those little training wheels that you can get. Someone else already thought about composition, costuming, poses, lighting, and I just get to take my colors and play around within that framework. The Holbein Irodori Autumn set can mix some very beautiful dark shades. I had worried that this would be a very limiting set with mostly yellows and oranges, but the single blue shade, Indigo, really ties it all together as a complementary color for all the orange and brown hues. Complementary colors are what you want to look for when mixing grays or even blacks. Blue and orange, red and green, violet and yellow. This is one of the last sketches I used to fill up this small sketchbook, and I filmed a tour of it a few weeks ago. I always come back to movie or master studies to de-stress, practice, or like here for general guidance when trying out something new. The great thing about movie studies is that you can really tailor them to your art style and interests. I love fantasy, gothic horror, dark and moody aesthetics, rich color palettes. But if I feel in the mood for a colorful or playful sketch, I can branch out and study a scene from a Ghibli movie or go for the dramatic lighting in science fiction. There's really something out there for every color palette and every mood. I already know how the Holbein gouache feel overall and have my favorite brushes to use with them. Still, here I experimented a bit with a layer of gesso on the watercolor paper to create different textures. And while I've used different Irodori gouache sets over the summer, each set of these, of course, comes with different features. I want to see which paints granulate, which ones apply transparently, which ones completely opaque. So this was a great first dive into this palette, just seeing what happens naturally. As always, I'm using a tube of white paint so that I have one fresh gouache paint to mix all of these dry colors with. After that Crimson Peak study, which, other than the yellow dress, had a lot of grey tones in it, I went for a second study that focused more on saturated, pure colors. My first impressions showed me that this scene from Interview with the Vampire with the green and ochre color palette would probably be a great fit for that. Now, I have to admit that this sketch took me quite a while. I struggled with the facial expressions, torn between focusing on my fun new colors and actually focusing on the portraits. Whenever I have difficulties with painting directly, I go back to some colored pencils to sketch in angles and find facial planes more easily. So I used colored pencils here, but not because I felt the paints didn't give me enough variety of color, just because I needed the crutch to get the expression to look how I wanted it. At this point, I really fell in love with this set for skin tones. There are two brown shades, a warm reddish brown and a cooler darker one, and then we have a whole spectrum through orange and amber to light yellows, and the greens to tone everything back down if we need to neutralize the color, or create olive undertones. Lestat in the background was the perfect fit for all of those warm amber hues, and the costuming here was a wonderful place to test out all the different greens in this set. I was tempted to leave his face as a blurry suggestion, but to practice I pushed through that stage and got into details the next morning. Maybe it's because I struggled so much with Louis' face that I was kind of dreading adding details to this one. So far, out of all the sets of Irodori gouache I've tried, I like the autumn set the most for portraiture. This step was a bit scary. Often a barely there suggestion of a face can be more interesting or more pleasing and a bit mysterious to look at. Going in with darker browns at first made everything look really strange and disjointed. But that's why I love gouache. The layering and building of paint, some messy brushwork to carve out what we see very slowly. I like to play with transparency too, and the Holbein artist's gouache can create some very beautiful transparent color layers. Not as luminous as watercolors, but still without that chalky finish that we can get from heavier paint application. That's why I like using these as dry paints in my palette. They reactivate really well and can then still build up nearly opaque layers if I use the right ratio of water. This is the scary part that I mentioned earlier. Since I'm kind of blocking in shadows over an already existing face, the eyes at first looked like googly eyes that I kind of just placed in the middle there. I promise this will get better as we keep on painting. When layering gouache, I have to be careful not to use too much water, so that I don't reactivate the paint that is underneath. But I haven't found that this is much of a problem with these paints so far. It might have been smarter to do what comes next before diving into movie scene studies, but I like to get an overall first impression without being too technical. So it was after I finished these 2 sketches that I sat down to create a couple mixing tests. There are 12 colors in this set, or rather 11 colors and then a tube of gold paint that I count as a separate thing. So I could make an elaborate mixing chart to show all the possible combinations, but honestly I prefer a much simpler approach. Color triads are one way to get to know a color palette, taking a set apart into smaller palettes that look beautiful or interesting or that create tension. The autumn set gives us nearly primary colors to mix with, a cool-toned safflower red, the indigo blue, and 2 yellows which I'll talk about in more detail later. Here I use the warmer kuchinashi yellow. So with those 3 we can mix orange, purple and green, giving us a pretty complete color wheel to work with, though leaning overall to the warmer side. But there can be simpler triads too. I focused on only earthy tones inspired by autumn leaves just before they fall to the ground for the second one, and for the third triad I went with more vibrant autumn leaf shades. Trees at the height of their colors with some still green and alive. If you prefer a more free-flowing mixing approach, I also experimented with these color blobs. These are great for seeing which paints create beautiful textures when mixing wet on wet, and I'm really enjoying the patterns here. The safflower red can go incredibly transparent, and both of the brown paints have granulation, so we have variety of texture overall. Now, one big difference from gouache to watercolors is usually our access to white and opaque paints. So when trying a new art supply, at some point it's a good idea to see where the unique strengths of it lie. White changes how paints look, even changing temperature and hue as well as just value. I picked a reference photo I took at a Korean temple that would let me experiment with both the darkest shades and light, nearly pastel tones. Gouache dries lighter than it looks when wet, so I like to see how my darkest shades perform before I tackle a larger painting. Here I left my shadows quite transparent, embracing the indigo blue hues and the granulating browns instead of smothering them into a uniform, opaque dark shade. For contrast, the lighter parts of the sketch are much more opaque. This palette can mix really beautiful turquoise colors, thanks to the indigo and our green paints. Perfect for this wooden fish. I want to take this set to a temple to paint on location soon, as the combination of paints here seems perfect for the typical tanchong colors of Korean traditional architecture. the way, since I mentioned that adding white paint to a mix changes not only the value but hue as well, I thought I'd add color swatches of all these mixed with permanent white. This made the difference between the two yellows look clearer and also showed me how pink the undertones of that safflower red really are. If you often mix with white or black paint, giving dedicated color swatches to those can be very helpful. After seeing how some of these paints look when mixed with white, I was then tempted into adding more layers to my little sketch here. I especially like how this brown shade looks mixed with white, a very soft, reddish, nearly burnt sienna shade. While I started out with movie studies, here comes another art comfort zone of mine for new art supplies: master studies. I picked a pre-Raphaelite painting, as I often do, Circe painted by Waterhouse. I actually chose it because it has opposite qualities to the temple sketch next to it. Instead of dark browns and light turquoise greens, the browns here are lighter and saturated, the turquoise dark. Gouache will never look as luminous as watercolors, or as deep and rich as oil paints or even acrylics. But still, this gave me a feel for how far I could push the vibrancy of some of these paints. The Ouni orange, mixed with Kohaku ember and permanent white, creates this beautiful burnished orange color that I loved for the trees in the background. And really, the indigo is an all-rounder in this palette, as the one truly cool color. It's not even a very cool blue, with some red pigments in it, but still it mixes beautifully with everything else to give us much more variety overall in what could otherwise be a very simplistic palette. I've been trying to learn more about pigments lately, and the Irodori gouache sets with their quite unique selections have been a great help. While I like reading and studying, for art, so much is really learning by doing. I created a color wheel very vaguely inspired by the one in James Gurney's book, as well as a new art book I've been reading, Color and Light, from the Artist's Master series. No need to be overly technical here. I just mapped out my colors along the color wheel, but also putting darker shades, like the browns, more towards the center. You can see how much of this palette clusters in the upper half of the color wheel, with warm greens and multiple yellows. Our indigo is made from phthalo blue, alizarin crimson and lamp black, leaning more towards the red. Not the coolest blue we could possibly have, so I didn't use the full range of my color wheel and placed it more towards the middle. I actually didn't have a plan for this and just started connecting some of my little color blobs with even smaller color mix blobs. Nothing too precise, no specific mixing ratios, I just wanted to see which gradients would look pleasing or interesting. I thought I'd stop after making a few of these color gradients, but this turned out to be so strangely meditative and addictive. I started to connect the less obvious paints using my pencil to add more or less helpful guidelines. It's chaotic but strangely intuitive while painting. I felt like I was creating a mandala or raking colorful sand into patterns, adding more branches and connections. If you, like me, feel that the measured, grid mixing charts are a bit stifling, I really recommend you give this approach a try. There's no right or wrong way to connect your paints, and if you have fewer paints in your palette, you could also create gradients with white or black, or showing different opaqueness and transparency levels to fill up your color wheel. The two yellows, Kuchinashi Gardenia yellow and Quijada Amur Cork yellow, are the two colors I'm a bit unsure about in this set. While they're both beautiful on their own, I think one of them could have been pushed either warmer or cooler. Quijada is a cooler pigment mix, including PG17 chromium oxide green, making it look greenish when applied very transparently. But it loses some of that quality when opaque. It does mix more vibrant greens when combined with the green paints, as well as the blue. Kuchinashi is a mix of Hansa yellow light and yellow iron oxide, so it has a warmer, earthier undertone, mixing subtler, more toned down greens. Again, both are beautiful on their own, but I wish the difference were more pronounced. Not only in hue, but maybe in paint consistency, as they both feel very similar in granulation, texture, and opaqueness. For the paints that were too far apart on the opposite side of the color wheel, I created strange spiraling branches heading into the general direction of their secondary color around the wheel. This entire color wheel, if I can even call it that, maybe color chart or color mandala of some kind, actually gave me a good overview of how this palette looks when you just try all kinds of different combinations. There's a lot of earthy, green tone mixes you can create, so we really have this spectrum of this being both great for warm-toned landscapes, and then on the other side, all the skin tone possibilities that I had mentioned during my movie scene studies. have to admit that some of those more spiraling additions to this chart might look not so intuitive when you just see me do it, but I think if you start your own, you, like me, will feel that this is actually really simple. It really soothed some kind of obsessive part inside of me that enjoys stuff like this, but doesn't enjoy using a ruler to make proper grids. Towards the end, I also added the antique rich gold, the warm gold paint that slots really nicely into the palette between the yellows and amber shades. I hope one or two of these color experiments that I finished in this video gave you ideas on how to approach testing out your own art supplies. New ones or old ones that you want to explore more. I love how my color wheel turned out, and it's now hanging on a wall near my desk, kind of a piece of art by itself. Thank you so much for watching.